So first of all, it's a thank you to the Institute of Sustainable Resources for inviting me to speak. And I suppose a small apology to all the rest of you. I am not of Professor Joel Comel's stature, but I hope I'll give you a few things to think about and to, if you want to say, chew on over the next 20 minutes. I'll do my best to keep on time. So essentially, I feel that in a way, part of my role here is to do a little bit of scene setting, but also perhaps to throw up a few ideas that that may find themselves discussed later in the session. So I'm going to start at a very basic point with water scarcity itself. The concept of water scarcity was perhaps first discussed at some of the UN population conferences during the Club of Rome, and much of the discussion about whether the world could feed itself in the late 60s and early 70s. And then the famine in Ethiopia in the mid-80s prompted Malin Falkenmark to discuss water scarcity as a way of trying to anticipate famines of that stature in the future. Could we anticipate these things? And so I suppose one of the things I would like to write right at the beginning is I hope you can see that water scarcity as a concept, right at its outset, had a direct connection with food. The other thing I'll just point out, Malin Falkenmark proposed this water stress index, which, whether you like it or not, is the most widely applied metric to define what we mean by water scarcity today. And the diagram is a straight copy from her paper in Ambio in 1989, and essentially it's a water crowding. And she was wondering how many people could be served by 1 million cubic meters of water per year. And essentially, drawing evidence from the state of Israel, she argued that 1,000 people before you moved into conditions of water crowding, 1,000 people could share 1 million cubic meters of water per year. You can invert that and then say, essentially, a per capita freshwater availability of 1,000 cubic meters per year per person. How would you define freshwater resources? Well, renewable freshwater resources were defined by mean annual river discharge. And at the time, there was a group in St. Petersburg who had been compiling observations. There were groups who were developing, at this time, global models. And the idea of, well, we could take fairly quickly data from observations or from models of river discharge, and we could reconcile them with, and that essentially, by the way, river discharge represents what we might call the blue water flux. So the net contribution of water to the land surface from precipitation after you subtract the evapotranspiration. And so these are defining it in terms of blue water resources. And again, population data exists. The UN has been doing this under its population division for some time, but taking those population data and an understanding of river discharge, you could fairly quickly begin to compute the number of people served by a particular amount of water, and therefore ascribe whether an area is water scarce or water stressed or relatively sufficient with respect to freshwater resources. Now, the connection to food is this. We recognize, and to this day, about irrigated agriculture accounts for about 70% of all global freshwater withdrawals. And so, when you think about it really, a water scarce area is one with an impaired or reduced capacity to irrigate. And if we're looking forward now, we might argue that's an area which would then have its pursuit of the Sustainable Development Goal 2 to end hunger, achieve food security, improve nutrition, and promote sustainable agriculture. We would argue that perhaps the inability or the reduced capacity to irrigate may in part promote food insecurity or impair, if you want to call it, food security. One important thing to note, a common misunderstanding. water scarcity is unrelated to access to safe water. And therefore, there is no relationship between water scarcity and whether or not people have water to drink. So that if you weren't aware of that myth, please be aware of it. This is some data, for instance, national statistics for countries across Africa. And you can see, for instance, just taking a couple of examples, you can see that per capita freshwater resources in the Democratic Republic of Congo are very, very substantial, yet less or approaching only 50% of the people have access to safe water. Let's look at Egypt. Much, much reduced, essentially a water scarce nation, yet it is approaching 100% or near 100% access to safe water. So there is clearly not a relationship between water scarcity and Sustainable Development Goal 6.1, but we might argue there's a strong relationship between water scarcity and Sustainable Development Goal 2. If we take up it comparatively, particularly in light of the Sustainable Development Goals, an area in which there's tremendous amount of development needs to take place, we look at in sub-Saharan Africa, food production depends primarily upon soil water, what we might call green water, not liquid flowing water in a river or within an aquifer. We're talking about water that is bound to the soil or within the physiology of the plant itself. As a region, sub-Saharan Africa, estimates from 2000 suggest that only about 4% of its cultivated land was under irrigation. Compare that with, say, South Asia or Southeast Asia, where it is more like 40%. Or the global average, which is somewhere around 18%. There is a kind of an interesting consequence of that. It means, for instance, this water scarcity threshold of 1,000 cubic meters of water per year greatly exaggerates freshwater demand in places, for instance, in East Africa, where per capita use is typically between 20 and 25 cubic meters per person per year. So we're holding a region and declaring it water scarce, even though it doesn't need anything like the amount of water that, say, a semi-arid developed country like Israel does. Okay. Essentially, it's a very inappropriate metric. While we're on a bit of a critical streak here, there's some models here. These are the global hydrological models. These are some global hydrological models that have been used to calculate water scarcity around the planet. And I'll start with, for instance, the paper in Millie. I think this one is nice and clear. And if you look at the data, by the way, for those of you who are interested in this area, it's important to recognize that the plots that you're seeing right now are log-log. Okay? They're not linear. They're log-log. And essentially, where you see blue dots, it means the model overrepresents it by more than 50%. Where you see red dots, it means the model underrepresents it, okay, by half. Essentially, for the model published in Nature in 2005 by Millie, half of the river basins that they were trying to model, they either modeled river discharge at less than half of what is observed, or more than double what was observed. It's not very precise. If you look, the following plot actually shows a comparison of two global hydrological models, Water Gap and PC Glub WB. Again, if you're in this business, those will be familiar to you. And this is a plot from the most recent paper by Petra Dole and the group. And the point being, these are log-log plots. And this is a comparison between the ability of those models to represent low flows and high flows. And you can see the Water Gap model does a fairly good job at high flows, but again, PC Glove not so well, and the other ones, again, even the Water Gap itself struggles to represent the low flows very well. I should say that Water Gap is the only one of the global hydrological models that is currently calibrated. Okay? So the global hydrological models that are being used to calculate freshwater resources on the planet are, with one exception, they're all uncalibrated. We really don't know whether those projections are correct or incorrect, or even the validity, how strong we might believe in them. So one sobering thought I would like to say is global water scarcity remains inadequately defined both by the models and by the metrics. There's a long way we can go to improving on this, and we can make some improvements comparatively quickly, I think. Clearly on the modeling front, people are working very hard to improve these models, and that will take longer, but certainly on the metrics, and I have a suggestion how we might move in that direction shortly. Well, let's look at how people have naturally adapted to freshwater, to water scarcity. And we can see on the left, of course, the use of canals. So drawing from water storage, taking water, you may know the canals themselves, where people have dug tunnels to allow water from higher pressure to flow naturally without the use of pumps from an area of higher water pressure to an area of lower water pressure. And clearly this is a way of redistributing water to areas of need, particularly for agriculture. Or other solutions are to store seasonal flows, for instance, in the construction of impoundment dams. And in fact, the World Bank has even suggested that reservoir storage could be equivalent to or reflect essentially development. Those with a very high per capita reservoir storage volume are developed, and those with a low per capita reservoir storage, they would argue would be comparatively undeveloped. And as I'll argue shortly, I think this is a rather narrow interpretation, and that there's a much broader perspective that might be considered. Essentially, if we look at how humans begin to disrupt, if you want to call it, or alter the terrestrial water cycle, the global water cycle, this is actually a focus of some significant amount of work by the modelers at the moment, beginning to recognize that the world is not a pristine place, and it has been substantially altered by human activity. And humans generally redistribute waters from rivers and aquifers to the land, and eventually to the atmosphere, through both irrigation and dams. And this, of course, is associated with energy production, and obviously recognizing the costs in terms of water resources associated with such energy production, and to regulate low flows. This is some work that some colleagues and I, led by Lala McDonald, the BGS, showed. And one thing just to indicate here is, in northwest India, for instance, engineering work from the 19th century all the way to present, and the digging of canals, unlined canals, across that area of northwest India has led to a very substantial rise in groundwater levels. So basically there was a century-long groundwater accumulation, and what we're looking now, associated with intensive use of groundwater for irrigation, is a depletion that follows a long-term groundwater accumulation. And this was achieved by basically people diverting water out of rivers into irrigation canals, and that acting as from a hydrogeologist perspective, a wonderful managed aquifer recharge system, where you're taking water out of rivers, distributing it around a landscape, and it leaks from those canals into the subsurface. Another thing we need to recognize, of course, is how humans also alter not only the quantity but also the quality of water resources themselves. And one of the things that we recognize in the Indo-Gangetic Plains and the Indo-Gangetic Basin, including both Bangladesh, Pakistan, and northern India, as well as parts of Nepal, is that the constraints, future constraints on water use in this area are actually not depletion or storage-based, but much more related to by volume due to quality. I would argue that actually we should redefine water scarcity not in terms of flows, but in terms of storage. And that actually where we run into problems is when we realize we have inadequate storage to meet an imbalance in flows. And anyway, I'll leave that for another. But the basic point about the storage here, the key point and where I would differ, for instance, from this focus on reservoir capacity, is you could look at storage in a much broader perspective. Storage not only associated with a reservoir, although that may be the case, they could be small scale, but also with groundwater, with soil water, rainwater harvesting from rooftop catchments. Storage does not have to be a large impoundment dam. It could be broad. The concept of storage needs to be broadened to both natural and constructed stores. Looking beyond reservoirs, substantial distributed natural groundwater storage exists. A big question is whether or not it's sustainable. Again, work with my colleague Alan McDonald at the BGS, we looked and quantified the volume of groundwater resources across Africa. And of course it was a first estimate, you might say, and all of this would need to be revised by more detailed local assessments. The basic point in showing you this figure is that the groundwater storage in many countries is 10 to 100 times the annual river flow of that country. And so you can see how a metric like the water stress index or other metrics that are based solely, okay, on river discharge are inadequate because they do not represent actually the water resources that are maybe available to address water shortages that a country may have, and critically, that being storage. The question of sustainability is a difficult one because our track record so far is not especially good. In some of the major agricultural regions on the planet, the California Central Valley, North China Plain, High Plains Aquifer in the US, Northwest India, even in very seasonally humid Bangladesh, what we're seeing is groundwater storage decline. So there's a net groundwater depletion taking place in all of these locations. And of course, the situation in California, particularly last year, is one that made headlines in many locations. So, although the track record is poor, I don't necessarily mean it suggests that groundwater is not a suitable source of storage for addressing water scarcity, particularly in relation to water for food. I say that in particular because climate change is expected to have some important impacts on the hydrological system. Now, we don't know, and there's great uncertainty about where it's going to be wetter and where it's going to be drier. But there's one characteristic about a warming world for which there is much agreement. More frequent and very heavy precipitation events, and fewer light and medium precipitation events. The consequence of this is more frequent and intense floods and longer droughts. The consequence of those from a blue water resources perspective is an intensified need for storage, okay, and I would argue groundwater dependence. The implication of this moves beyond just river and groundwater resources. More variable rainfall leads to more variable soil moisture, reducing crop yields and increasing irrigation requirements. You either accept a reduction in your crop yield or you adapt and you draw water to try to supplement that decline in soil moisture through some kind of supplementary irrigation. There's an interesting bit of science that maybe many in the room won't be familiar with, so as a hydrogeologist I feel a bit duty-bound to explain. And that's that the intensification of precipitation as a result of global warming actually from a water hydrological point of view, from a water balance point of view, favors groundwater recharge, particularly in the tropics. So groundwater there becomes a kind of natural, if you want to call it hydrological, solution to adapting to this change, using groundwater to adapt to this change in soil moisture. So I focused a tremendous amount on blue water. Sorry, now there's a feedback echo. And so, of course, I knew that Tony was going to be here, and I knew that I would have to say a few words about this. And the bit is, can we trade ourselves out of water scarcity? Meaning, can we address water scarcity not through engineering and pipes, or even wells, although I may advocate for it? Can we trade our way? So can the virtual water trade, through movements of agricultural products and other commodities, and I'm sure most of you are familiar with these sort of numbers, about a kilo of rice or a kilo of maize. And I think all of us are familiar about these numbers. Oh, a particular debt to Tony for that. Now, can we address water scarcity through the importation of food from water-sufficient countries to water-scarce countries? So water-scarce countries no longer need to live under the label of being water-scarce because they no longer have necessarily the ambition to grow all of their own food, but to import it. If we look at the moment, this is some of the work done by Arjen Hoekstra and others, at where the virtual water trade looks like at a global scale. The green in this plot, if you're not unfamiliar with it, are areas where they have a net virtual water flow out, and the red are areas where they have a net virtual flows in. So you can see that here we are in Western Europe, particularly if we think of Germany, Spain, and the UK, in bright red. And we, of course, largely consume imported food now, rather than we are no longer anywhere near self-sufficient. But if you look at the details, arguably trade is more often from water-scarce countries to water-sufficient countries. I'm sure Tony will have a word or two about that, but that is maybe a somewhat superficial or casual observation from the data that are there. So I'm sure I've run out of time, so I'll just sum up and say a few concluding thoughts. The global water crisis is inadequately defined both by the models and the metrics. I don't necessarily mean go ahead and we need more research, but I think what I would like us to say is to have a humility about how imperfect our understanding of the global hydrological system remains in a quantitative sense, and at the moment how we keep applying comparatively inappropriate metrics to define that. And clearly, in case anyone was out, water scarcity is completely unrelated to access to safe water. So groundwater, as a hydrogeologist, I'm biased of course, represents both a key constraint to global food production, issues around depletion and quality, but also as a key opportunity to adapt to climate change. And although I think there is tremendous opportunity here in using the virtual water trade to address water scarcity, I suppose at the moment that ambition perhaps doesn't seem to be fully realized, and maybe there's ways of addressing that. I'm not an economist, evidently. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Richard. Well, you have been precisely in time, so thank you very much indeed. Well, I would also like to congratulate you for doing exactly what we thought you could eventually do, like casting some doubts on the key metrics and the key discourse on what scarcity actually is about, and then indeed coming up with some of the potential solutions like storage, but then indeed also while addressing the need to better understand the mechanisms of replenishment, and coming up also with the concept of virtual trade. The guy you mentioned here, Tony, is Tony Allen, who's sitting over there, who sort of pioneered this research over the last year. So just a short hand for Tony. The floor is now open for some 10 minutes of Q&A. So if anybody, and this includes Tony indeed, but all of you, wishes to ask a question or make a comment, feel free to do so. There should be microphones around, and I'm pretty sure, so please identify yourself. And then, well.
Tom Hurdle, Purdue University. I was really interested in your comment that intensification of rainfall will favor groundwater recharge in the tropics. Can you explain that? And presumably if it goes into the groundwater, it doesn't go somewhere else.
Yeah, you're quite right that needs some qualifying statements, okay. What I would say is this. First of all, there's mounting evidence that has been generated for this. So if you look at the chemical signature of groundwater, it is across the tropics. It has the same isotopic chemical signature as heavy rainfalls, not the mean average rainfall. So the chemistry of the groundwater across the tropics is biased to heavy rainfalls. That is something that's been demonstrated. We've also shown from piezometric measurements that there is a bias that heavy rainfalls disproportionately contribute to groundwater recharge. Part of the problem here, which you may be beginning, is process and mechanism. What we've known for a long time is that when water moves through the soil, it does not, like anywhere, like if you have a leak in your roof, it does not naturally all decide to move through the matrix of the soil. Much of it can move through preferential pathways through a soil zone. And so our conceptual understanding of how aquifers are replenished needs to take on board the fact that infiltration capacities of soils, may not be defined simply by, say, texture, that actually there are secondary characteristics of these soils that often control how they respond. That being said, there will be environments where the soil cover is such that it won't allow that intensified precipitation to infiltrate. But what we have seen is that a surprising number of different geological and soil environments, you find a consistency in that the heavy rainfalls do seem to get transmitted to the subsurface to replenish those aquifers. If you have any further information, I can happy to send you papers and everything like that, all that literature.
Hi, Henry Lusengård, DEFRA. I've got a sort of follow-up question on that because I think this is a fascinating issue because I sort of had the understanding that with increasing intensity of rainfall that you could get more runoff rather than sort of soaking in. That's my sort of very basic sort of understanding. But there's also, we had some work done looking at how climate change might affect ground cover and also looking at sort of future land use and how that's sort of all combined with changes in intensity of rainfall. They didn't actually conclude anything, but I just wonder what your opinion, if you put all those different things into the mix, how will they play against each other?
Of course, it's difficult with single rules here. I would say that it was a colleague and I who put together these chemical signatures, and we were actually a bit shocked how consistent. So of the long stations that the IAEA, International Atomic Energy Agency, observes across the tropics, there are 15 of them that have very long time series. 14 of them showed a consistent, where the groundwater located them, had a signature that was consistent with heavy rainfalls, not all rainfalls. So I guess what I'm trying to say is the evidence is quite compelling, but there's all this stuff about how do you understand process, and then how do you disentangle it from things like land use change? Are you familiar with the Sahelian paradox? Do you know?
No, but I'd love to hear.
The Sahelian paradox is this, is that when rainfall declined in the eastern Sahel, groundwater levels rose and river discharge increased. And the argument is, well, it's a paradox, of course. How can that be? Well, if you go back to your very simple hydrological balance, the only way that's possible is that the evapotranspirative component had to have decrease. There are also changes in the runoff coefficients as well, but the critical probably the critical one was that the evapotranspiration reduced. So what they had done at the same time that the drought was taking place, people were removing perennial grass cover and putting in shallow root crops, and that changed the water demands, you would say, of the soil cover, of the vegetation cover, and that in part accounts for the fact that there was more of the precipitation was converted to blue water, if you will, than to green water. So I guess my way to try to answer your question is, land use can have a very fundamental influence on that terrestrial water balance. And the additional point is, the evidence at the moment is from piezometry and from chemical signatures. There's a lot of work that needs to be done to better understand exactly what those relationships are, because we also see greater soil erosion that is taking place associated with the removal of cover. So it is complicated, but I do think a comparatively blunt statement can be made that the intensive rainfall favors the groundwater recharge. Yeah.
Hi, Louise Bracken, Durham University. What would the timescale or the lag be between the heavy storms and then being
So
able
what
to...
are the lags between?
The time lag between the heavy rainfall appearing and then being able to see the signature in the groundwater?
Yeah, that's interesting, because what you get extremely rapid, what you would call inferred vadose zone loss. Sorry, I'm using okay, the unsaturated zone. So for instance, from the ground surface to the water table, I'll give you okay. In different environments, we're looking at lag times of, say, between 2 weeks and 6 weeks to travel, say, 8 to 10 meters, which is very rapid. That's much more rapid than we would expect for things moving through the matrix. What we've also found, by the way, recent work that we've been doing in Bangladesh, what we found there is you can get rapid responses, but it's not flow. If you flood a landscape, you create a greater water pressure on the soils themselves. And so what happens, you can see flood events in Bangladesh, and you can see them compressing those thick sediments, and you can actually get pressure responses, which are, maybe the answer, are instantaneous. And that, you know, is not flow. The other ones, where you see lag times of sometimes it can be between, let's say, 1 and 3 months. This is where you know this is happening on comparatively rapidly, but it wouldn't be a deformation response. It would be a flow response. Yeah.
Actually, yep, Tony? Oh, other hand going up here.
Tony Allen from King's College in SOAS in London. Thank you, Richard. Thank you for the plug. A much bigger idea than embedded water is the fact that we must spot that farmers manage water. You've even actually mentioned it just here, that the thing that changed was the behavior of the thing that changed the hydrological circumstances was the behavior of the farmer. Well, that's happening on a global scale, because 92%-ish of water that we consume in an economy or individually is embedded in food. And that is managed almost wholly by farmers. They have bits of infrastructure that engineers have provided, which provide some sort of control, but the actual allocation on the farm is done by farmers. And so the link between water and us and the farmers is food. I'm interested, I haven't been following the work here on food and security, but the water is... If we as water scientists, so my plug here is, please let's not be water-centric. Not water-centric, which obviously we naturally are as water people, is we must understand that it is the farmers who manage, so we need to understand food. So things that happen in the food supply chain are more important than things that we model and think about.
No, I would agree. In the current work that we're doing at the moment, we are research teams in Ethiopia, Tanzania, and Niger. We're working with farmers themselves to find out about how they're using it, how much they're using it, and why and when. Because we understand that and recognize that if you're thinking about scaling up, you're going to have to understand how people use that water. You can't just sort of make blind assumptions about that.
Henry?
Sorry, maybe I'm just quick at putting my hand up before everyone else. Sorry. I just wondered, a good mate of mine who's an Asian-based modeler did a whole sort of a model of the Sahel Desert, looking at the sort of movement of different tribes under different climate change scenarios. And I wonder, it'd be quite interesting maybe to try and link some Asian-based modeling, which we did here, and look at the different sort of scenarios of future land use and so forth, so you can get the actual behavior of different agents and then link it to the effect on land use and therefore recharge and water sort of areas.
It's a good point, and if you're interested in that area, we may be generating some data for you. We have, in the current work we're doing, we have what we call basin observatories in Niger and in Tanzania. In Niger, there has been substantial land use change in the study areas we're working in over the last 3 to 4 decades. In the area we're working in Tanzania, it's been much, much less. Surface water fed irrigation, but a number of plots, and the change has not been so much. So we're trying to better understand by, if you go back the last 20, using the past to understand the future, how has that land use change impacted the terrestrial water balance in the areas that we're working more precisely, so that we can better understand those linkages. But that is the idea of those trying to unpick, for instance, again, the Sahelian paradox as an example, because if we're going to start thinking about converting more land into cultivatable land, or bringing more under irrigation, we need to basically have a better understanding what the consequences of that are. Yeah.
Thank you. Actually, I have a last question myself. Richard, the slide you had on the estimated storage in Africa, in a way, looked promising.
Yes.
And
Yes.
that region where we typically think they are water scarce seem to have huge water reservoirs. And
Yes.
two of the countries I picked up were Libya and Southern Africa, South
Yeah.
Africa, where you have lots of conflicts related to water stress. So what is your own perspective on what might happen in those countries, or where research could actually help to solve some of the issues there that are related to water stress? And are similar assessments also going on with regard to other continents like Asia?
Well, you may know that the vast volumes of groundwater beneath the Sahara, which are in areas, say, underlain in the sandstone aquifer, regional sandstone aquifers underneath Libya. First of all, these have been tapped very substantially. And there's the great man-made river project of Libya, where they are bringing water from the desert with these production wells and pipelines to bring it to the coast. The water there was replenished between 5,000 and 25,000 years ago. So none of it is, well, there's very small contributions runoff from some of the highlands in the south, but mostly you're mining water in this area like you're mining oil. So I suppose you could treat fossil groundwater reserves in this area a bit the way you would probably treat oil, as a kind of unsustainable pumpage. It doesn't mean you don't use it. I think sustainability can be a tyranny. There may be substantial benefits from drawing out fossil groundwater resources, even if they are, by definition, unsustainable. But it needs to be thought through very carefully, because you need to know that one day it won't be there. So, yeah.
All right. One more, all right, maybe short, please.
Okay, you hear about groundwater pollution a lot in the media and stuff like that. How safe do you think our groundwater is from?
So unfortunately, I've come to work without my hearing aids in. So yeah, can you say it again?
You hear a lot about groundwater pollution in the media and other sources. I was just wondering, how safe do you think our groundwater is from companies like BHP?
That's a loaded question to generalize. I would say, on average, groundwater resources are better protected than surface water resources by virtue of being in the subsurface. And in many instances, you'll find that groundwater is superior quality, particularly microbiologically. Yes, there has been groundwater contamination, issues of arsenic and salinity, which I mentioned from South Asia. But as a default, you could guess that the groundwater quality is very good. I'll give you one very brief comment on that, because it's something that makes my blood boil a little bit. For instance, the groundwater quality beneath London and Birmingham, as two examples, is very good. So it is I have no idea whatsoever, well, apart from being a cynic, why Boris Johnson gave the green light for a desalinization plant in Beckton, when we should have been pumping water out of chalk aquifers that are underneath the London, rather than taking water out of the sea. When you think of the energy costs of that, and when you think of the stupidity of it, basically, you're taking seawater, which has obviously got a huge amount of salt in it, and you've got fresh groundwater underneath London, which is of very good quality, almost drinkable at source. Some places, no, it's awkward, but many of the wells in central London have very good quality water. Obviously, they would need some treatment, but it would be comparatively minor compared to taking the salt out of seawater. So, yes, there are groundwater quality problems, and they are growing in rapidly urbanizing cities in many areas, okay? But I think at a first point, I would just say that the groundwater quality is generally superior to that of surface water.
All right, thanks a lot indeed. Whatever question you may still have, you can probably wait for the coffee break, and Richard hopefully will be around. So I would now like to conclude the